Hey everyone, and welcome back to English Through Fiction. Every day, we dive into exciting stories to help you improve your English. Today's episode continues our journey through Wander West, In Shadow. We're listening to Episode 3, Hunted, and getting ready for another adventure in learning English through fiction. Today, we'll be using some specific words in our story. Let's go over them briefly first. Mindless, hardtack, chatterbox, outsider, clutch, and mutter. We'll explain each one in more detail after this. Mindless. M-I-N-D-L-E-S-S. Mindless. Mindless means not thinking or not needing thought. It's like when you do something without really using your brain, something automatic. Okay, so, a few examples. He did his work with mindless attention, not even realizing the music was still playing. She was in the queue for hours and just watched a mindless TV show. Hardtack. H-A-R-D-T-A-C-K. Hardtack. Hardtack is a very hard and dry biscuit. It was eaten by sailors and soldiers because it lasts for a long time without going bad. Here are some examples. During his long trip, all the sailor ate was hardtack and dried meat. The old box held nothing but crumbs from old pieces of hardtack that were never eaten. Chatterbox. C-H-A-T-T-E-R-B-O-X. Chatterbox. Chatterbox means someone who talks a lot, often about unimportant things. It can also describe someone who says too much, who tells other people secrets. Okay, here are a couple of examples. My sister is such a chatterbox. She talks for hours and hours on the phone. Don't tell him any secrets. He is a chatterbox and will tell everyone. Outsider. O-U-T-S-I-D-E-R. Outsider. Outsider means a person who is not part of a group or place. This person does not belong there. Sometimes it can also mean that person is different from others in a particular society. Let me show you how we can use it in a sentence. She felt like an outsider at the party because she didn't know anyone. As a newcomer to the city, he still felt like an outsider looking in. Clutch. C-L-U-T-C-H. Clutch. A clutch is a group of eggs in a nest. Animals, mostly birds, lay their eggs at the same time, in the same place. The group of those eggs is a clutch. Let's look at some examples. The mother duck protected her clutch of 10 eggs from the rain. The scientist counted 15 eggs in the turtle's clutch. Mutter. M-U-T-T-E-R. Mutter. Mutter means to speak quietly and unclearly, sometimes because you are annoyed or unhappy. Here are some sentences. He was muttering to himself as he cleaned the dirty dishes, looking angry. She muttered, "I can't believe he said that," when the boy shared an outrageous claim. Alright, you've learned all the new words. Get ready, because we're about to blast off into a world of adventure. The moon, a thin yellow crescent in the night sky, watched Bartimaeus. He walked on, very tired. The night was quiet and still. He knew he had lost the dark figure he'd been chasing. Without delay, he'd returned to Prayet's house and the road. He set off again immediately. The demon hadn't lied. Staying in a place where someone was hunting him was impossible. He had been seen. But why? Why was someone hunting him? He had no clue who the dark figure was. He'd only glimpsed their face, a flash of pale in the deep darkness. That was all. Yet one detail scared him: the pointed, wide-brimmed hat. Many travelers wore wide-brimmed hats for shade. This particular style, however, usually marked someone who practiced magic. Not everywhere, of course. Bartimaeus never wore one, nor had his teachers. But the further west one traveled, the more common they became. It fit. Someone skilled in magic could hide themselves, stalk invisibly, remain hidden even by Flit. He looked at his shoulder. His pet bird perched there, sleeping uneasily. Flit had protested against riding there. Bartimaeus understood. Flit's pride would make him fly until he dropped from tiredness just to keep up. Bartimaeus might still need the little bird to look ahead. Better to let him rest while he could. He also didn't want Flit near their hunter. Someone with magic could trap Flit, pull him from the sky. They could come close while Bartimaeus slept, bypass his protective signs, and kill him. So why hadn't they? Why were they just following? He would have left even if he hadn't seen his hunter. He didn't know what became of Coxton Priet. He had to assume there were more vulture men than the dead one he'd found. Perhaps the hunter had escaped. He wanted to believe that. He couldn't risk their return, though. Staying was too dangerous. He didn't recognize the creatures. He'd never heard of them, even in Congar, where men lived near the forest's edge. Mother Pris hadn't warned him either, and she knew of the Dolmex, another type of demon. Some fairies had animal features. He didn't think these were fairies. He'd heard of men changing into beasts, becoming more beast than man, but never a vulture. It didn't matter. They could be something else, something from the outside, something that had slipped into this world. Such things were common now. He remembered his last teacher. He could still picture the stout, scarred old man rocking in his chair, puffing his pipe. The world is tired, boy. It grows thin, everywhere. It fades, and the outside slips in through the cracks. Bartimaeus was thankful for his caution. After he fled, as darkness deepened and the cold air bit, he heard cries echoing in the distance. They sounded like the harsh, whistling screams of vultures. The sounds scared him. He forced himself to listen carefully. He wasn't a master woodsman. Someone more skilled might have done better. He thought he heard at least 3 calling to each other. Maybe more. He pushed himself to a near run, trying to escape the cries. And the hunter. Perhaps the hunter, whoever they were, could communicate with the vulture men. Maybe they had revealed his location. He kept looking over his shoulder, fearing what he might see. Sometimes he even walked backward, searching for torchlight in the distance. He almost tripped several times. He barely had moonlight to guide him. Travel would have been hopeless without the road. Hours passed since he last heard the cries. His pace slowed. He knew he had to stop soon. He was used to long walks. His legs ached, his feet throbbed. Walking tomorrow would be painful. If he pushed himself too hard, he might not be able to move at all. The fear that had given him energy disappeared with the fading cries. Tiredness returned. He gently nudged Flit awake. He whispered, asking him to fly up one last time, high, to search for signs of pursuit. Lights, anything. Flit, annoyed at being woken, ruffled his feathers. He hadn't wanted to sleep, ashamed of the stain on his honor. Now he didn't want to be awake. Still, the little bird took to the sky. While Flit scouted, Bartimaeus stumbled off the road and into the woods. He searched for shelter. He quickly found what he sought. A hollow in the gnarled trunk of an old beech tree, the ground thick with dried leaves. He'd seen it from the road, hoping it would be a good hiding spot. He would have preferred to go deeper into the woods, away from the road. He couldn't steer through the rough ground in the darkness. He barely had enough light to scratch protective magic symbols, magic warnings, into the dirt. They would warn him of anyone coming close. Flit returned. He'd seen no lights, nothing to suggest pursuit. He settled in the beech's branches. Bartimaeus nestled among the roots, covering himself with dead leaves. Then he cast a trick, a magic fake image, to hide himself. He had a natural talent for such magic, though he was untrained. His last teacher hadn't known much about tricks. He had taught Bartimaeus the use of symbols, forging magic into signs, like the warnings he used, or the circle that held back the Dolmex. Tricks could be simple, small things. They worked best by playing on what people think will happen. When people saw a pile of leaves, They didn't expect to see a wizard below. They expected more leaves. The trick simply confirmed their expectations. Tricks worked best when you could see the person you were trying to fool. However, there was a way to make a trick work for anyone. You whispered to the world itself, declaring the fake image as truth. Bartimaeus had heard rumors that such magic led to even bigger secrets of magic, but he didn't know for sure. The trick would be good protection, unless the hunter also used magic. Then they might see through it. It would have to be enough. Bartimaeus was so tired that even fear couldn't keep him awake. His black furred cloak, warmed by magic, felt very comfortable against the growing chill. A few hours' sleep, Bartimaeus thought, then a good breakfast, and a full day's walk to put distance between me and the vulture men. He fell into a deep sleep without dreams before finishing the thought. He awoke to a pale gray sky, the kind that might clear or bring thunderstorms. His legs felt heavy, and he knew they wouldn't loosen until they were moving again. He listened to his pet bird, expecting Flit's usual morning song. It took a moment to realize Flit wasn't singing. He was speaking, his twittering conveying a message. A vulture man was coming close on the road. It would arrive soon. Bartimaeus froze. He whistled back to Flit, telling him to be quiet. Did the creature understand bird language? It was part bird, after all. Slowly, carefully, he picked up his crossbow and loaded a bolt. He held the crossbow close, straining to hear. The beech tree hid him from the road. The ground sloped down from the road, covered in thick bushes. Even without the trick, he doubted anyone on the road could see him. At least, he hoped so. They can't be following me, hunting me. Luck has truly cursed me if they are. Please, let them pass. Even better, let them turn back. He listened hard, but heard no footsteps. Only the rustling leaves, the distant cooing of a dove, and his own pounding heart. Is it still coming? Flit would have warned him if it had turned back. Then, suddenly, he knew it was there. A sense of wrongness, like a sore in his mouth he couldn't stop touching, or a stone in his boot, or a wrong note in a familiar song. Something felt out of place, something that shouldn't be there. The crossbow shook in his hands. Let it pass by. It didn't. The feeling lingered. Then he heard it. Not footsteps, but a chirping, clicking sound, like its beak. Go, you damned, awful thing. Bartimaeus thought angrily, as if his will could change reality. Bad cursed thing, luck tear out your heart, just go. It didn't go. The feeling remained, the chirping continued, and a new sound joined them. The crunch of footsteps on leaves. Flit cried out, taking flight. The creature had left the road and was coming towards him. He risked a quick look around the tree trunk. There it was, nearby, in the tangled bushes. Like the other one, it wore skins and dull gray feathers. Its back was to him, its beak held high, sniffing the air, watching Flit, chirping. That's how it found me, Bartimaeus realized grimly. He could fool eyes with a trick, but not a nose. He raised his crossbow and aimed. He'd only meant to look, but he knew he had to kill it. It had its back to him. He paused to steady his breath and aim. The back of the creature's head split open between the feathers. A bright yellow eye stared straight at him. Bartimaeus jerked, almost dropping his weapon. The creature whipped its head around, its gaze locking onto him. How could he have thought their eyes looked human? Only in death, perhaps. Alive, they burned with a wild, animal hunger, nothing like a human's. It screamed, a vulture's scream, but filled with rage, not mindless animal panic. It charged. Bartimaeus fired. Luck favored him. The demon clutched its throat, making bubbling sounds, its mad rush slowing. It still crashed into him. Everything turned to chaos. He was on the ground. He didn't even remember falling. The creature was on top of him. Its bloody beak snapped near his face. He pushed its face away. One wide, wild eye, burning with hunger, stared at him. He jammed his thumb into it. The demon shrieked. He groped for his sword. Pain ripped through his side twice. The creature shuddered, going still. Bartimaeus realized his sword was in his hand, its blade buried in the demon's chest. He couldn't recall pulling it out. He pushed the creature off, pulling his sword free. It lay there, breathing its last, its eyes filled with hatred, until he drove his sword through its face. It twitched, twisted, and finally stopped moving. "You had to, of course," Bartimaeus said to the body, pulling his sword free. "You had to have an eye in the back of your dirty head." He hated the creature. Even dead, it filled him with disgust, more than just because it was a demon. He didn't know why. Flit returned, landing by the ruined face. He sang a victory song, dipping his beak in the blood. He clearly approved of the demon's death, insulted by its mockery of bird form. For such a small bird, he could be bloodthirsty. "We aren't safe yet," Bartimaeus told him. "Go and scout. Tell me if you see any more close by. We can't stay here." Flit flew off. Bartimaeus stood up, groaning as pain shot through him. He was covered in blood, not all of it the vulture man's. The demon clutched a bloody knife. Bartimaeus felt blood dripping down his side. The cuts didn't seem too deep, at least. He hoped his leathers had taken the brunt of the attack. He had to hope. He couldn't stay here. He was stiff from days of marching, his mind unclear from lack of sleep, bleeding and wounded. He couldn't rest. He had to assume the creature had friends. They would come looking. He had to move, quickly. He realized, far away in his thoughts, this was what being hunted to death felt like. How quickly luck changed. Just yesterday morning, he'd hoped for a bed in Coxton Prayet's home. Now he might not even survive the one-road wood. "No, I can't die here. The Dolmek said I would be in Silverfish, and so I shall be." It was a small comfort, and a strange one. The words of a wicked demon gave him hope. It was true, though. Bartimaeus didn't know much about predictions, but he knew Dolmeks were supposed to be powerful predictors. Did that mean what it said was more likely to be true? How far could he push that? Could he abandon caution, knowing he was destined for Silverfish? Bartimaeus didn't want to test that theory. The fight had energized him. He would use that energy while it lasted. He grabbed his crossbow and bag, wiping his sword on his cloak before putting it away. He didn't wait for Flit. Flit could find him. He unwrapped some stale bread and hard cheese, eating them quickly as he walked, leaving crumbs scattered on the demon's body. As full of energy as he felt at first, the rush faded quickly. His body let him down. The ache in his muscles and the pain in his side became worse as he walked. Fear went away as he continued without hearing the vulture men's cries. He should be afraid. One had found him. They could be searching for him, hunting him. The lack of cries didn't mean they weren't following. Perhaps they'd heard their companions' death cries and were now being silent. He could think of 1,000 reasons to be afraid, reasons that should make him run. He couldn't feel the fear, though. Not without something right there to trigger it. His body only felt tiredness. Oh, if death were staring him in the face, he might find some extra strength. But he knew that if he didn't rest soon, he might not even have that. He walked on unsteadily, forcing his stiff legs to move, his clothes rubbing against his cuts with every step. His messy hair, filled with leaves, was soaked with sweat despite the chill. Flit reported seeing no chasers, but what comfort was that? He still had his follower to worry about, the hunter. They could be working with the demons. If they practiced magic, they might have called the demons. If they could conceal themselves with magic, surely they could conceal their servants. They'd be even more careful now, after he'd seen them. He was assuming the worst, but caution was necessary when his life was at stake. He walked like this for 2 days, pushing himself to his very edge, staying on the road until nightfall, never lighting a fire, sleeping lightly under tricks and warnings, his weapons close by. He cleaned his cuts as best he could. They weren't too deep, but deep enough. Constant movement kept making them bleed again. He kept Flit at the rear, watching for chasers. For 2 days, neither of them saw or heard anything. The skies remained gray, but the rain was only a light rain. He was grateful for that. Finally, on the 3rd day, waking under a fallen tree, he allowed himself hope. Perhaps he'd escaped both the demons and his hunter. If they were keeping pace, they would have caught him by now. Wouldn't they? He thought he understood what happened. A group of magic users must have claimed the One Road Wood, or part of it. He'd heard tales of such things, and the stories. Anyone who practiced magic was set apart, if not feared. Some wizards and witches truly abandoned humanity, hiding in the wilds, practicing dark magic, talking to the dead, consorting with demons and outsiders. He remembered Mother Priss, only half human. Perhaps this group was her mother's. Did that make sense, though? She seemed friendly with Coxton, and the huntsman was probably killed by the group too. Martimaeus shook his head. Perhaps the group and Coxton had an agreement that had recently broken down. Perhaps something else had happened. He'd likely never know. If he had been in a group's territory, he was lucky to have escaped. If he had escaped. He had. He must have. He really needed to rest. A lot of guesses about nothing. Who knows if the group even exists? That day he still kept Flit scouting, but didn't push himself as hard. Midday arrived, and he was still safe. He stopped to hunt, catching a rabbit with his crossbow. His spirits lifted. He could have a feast tonight, a trail feast. Hardtack bread, cheese, sour cucumbers, and roasted rabbit. Not bad at all. That evening, he stopped early. He hadn't traveled half the distance of the day before, but he'd heard a small river nearby. He wanted to refill his water bottles and bathe. It was a good spot. Off the road, the land sloped steeply down. He found a hidden hollow beneath a rock shelter, shielded by tree roots. He could safely make a fire here. He built a fire ring and gathered wood, looking for Flit. He hadn't seen his pet bird for a while. He wasn't too worried. Flit often disappeared for hours unless he saw something important. The hard pace had kept Flit flying constantly, tiring him out, though the proud bird would never admit it. Perhaps he could find some berries for him. Leaving the rabbit and his bag, Martimaeus followed the sound of rushing water. It was further and larger than he expected, a wide, shallow stream flowing easily over silt and rock. Long water plants swayed in the current. Golden-leaved willows dipped their branches towards the water. The gentle murmur of the stream calmed his troubled heart. Martimaeus filled his water bottles and then stripped to bathe. The icy water shocked him. It was calming, though, and his skin was caked with dirt and dried blood. He washed his clothes first, as well as he could. They were filthy, stiff with blood, his and the demons. The water he wrung out was muddy brown. He whispered to them with magic, like he did with his cloak at night, to make them dry faster. This was his greatest magical talent so far, and he'd met those who envied it. Controlling fire wasn't unusual for wizards, but fine control was difficult. Fire, at least as Martimaeus worked with it, felt like a hungry beast, its appetite growing with every feeding. It had taken practice to find the balance, to warm his cloak without burning it. Washing himself, he winced at the cuts in his side. They still bled when he touched the healing skin. The flesh around them felt hot and tender. He didn't know much about healing. He just hoped they didn't get infected. A gentle rain began. The raindrops felt pleasant on his skin. Circles spread across the stream. A sense of peace calmed him. The woods had such moments of grace. It was a pity they were so dangerous now. They hadn't always been. The road was proof of that. Only faint memories remained of a time when the wilds weren't dark and scary. Even in the best times, merchants traveled with guards. These weren't the best of times. Lost in thought, Martimaeus stared across the stream. The forest there gave way to maples, their leaves a vibrant red, their trunks almost black by comparison. The fallen leaves carpeted the ground, bright even in death. The more he looked, the stranger that forest seemed, yet the more familiar it felt. The black trunks looked almost like pillars, like they formed roads.
Who gave you permission to bathe in Lob's stream, boy?
Bartimaeus jumped, nearly losing his balance. He looked around quickly, but saw no one. "Who's there?" he called, backing towards the bank where his weapons lay.
Don't you go a-running now. Answer the question.
Finally, he spotted the speaker. On the opposite bank, sitting on a rock, sat a tiny man, no taller than a child. His features were gnarled and knotted like tree roots. He wore a bright red cloak, the color of the maple leaves, and his tiny eyes burned above a bumpy nose and a white beard. Bartimaeus stopped, choosing his words carefully. "I didn't know this stream belonged to Lob. I'm sorry. Would you tell them I apologize?" The little man got angry, showing yellowed teeth.
Lob is me, you silly chatterbox. And you'd better be sorry. Lob saw you making his pretty little stream dirty with all your dirt. Dirty boy?
He gnashed his teeth and stamped his foot. A sly grin spread across his face.
Maybe Lob will teach the dirty boy some respect.
Bartimaeus bowed as low as he could while naked. "My apologies, good Lob," he said politely. "I am Bartimaeus, the wizard. I meant no insult. I've had a hard few days traveling. I only wanted to wash, not knowing it was yours. Had I known, I would have asked permission." The grin vanished, replaced by a frown.
A wizard! A wizard!
The little monster muttered, stroking his beard.
A wizard! Bah! At least you have some manners. Lob forgives you.
He said the last word as if it pained him. Bartimaeus backed up, dressing. His clothes were still damp, but the magic he'd woven would dry them soon. "Might I ask permission for my pet bird to bathe and drink from your stream? He's a cardinal named Flit." Lob snarled, squeezing his fists.
Lob allows it,
he snapped.
so long as you're staying on that side. This side belongs to Lob.
The little man jumped like a frog and vanished. Not his voice, though. One last cry of, "Stay out!" Then silence. He sighed in relief. This wasn't entirely unexpected. The one-road wood was said to be monster-haunted. That meant little. Monsters could be anything, some looking quite human, all of them tricky. Lob seemed to fear magic, like many monsters. He doubted the little monster would be dangerous, as long as he didn't anger it and followed its rules. Still, he considered moving camp. He'd rather not sleep near an angry monster. He decided against it. He didn't want the trouble of finding a new spot. The bath had calmed him, and he was hungry. He wanted a good meal, a warm fire, and a good night's sleep. Lob would leave him alone as long as he stayed away from the stream. He was still thinking about this when he returned to his camp. It wasn't until he'd brushed aside the tree roots and stepped under the rock shelter that he noticed the figure, in a dark, wide-brimmed hat, deep in the shadows, grinning at him. And that's all the story we have for you today. Some of the words in the story might be tricky, but it's okay. They help us understand the setting. A cardinal is a type of bright red bird, like Flit, Bartimaeus' pet. Cardinals are known for their beautiful singing. Vulture men are scary creatures in the story that are part vulture and part man. They hunt and attack Bartimaeus. The one-road wood is a dangerous forest where Bartimaeus travels. It's described as dark, monster-haunted, and filled with unexpected danger. That's it for today's adventure in Wander West in Shadow. We hope you enjoyed learning English through this exciting story. Join us next time for another episode where we'll uncover even more. Goodbye for now, and see you in the next episode.